Have you ever stopped to question the intriguing situation of Cain, one of the first sons of Adam and Eve, according to the biblical narrative? How could he have a wife? And even more perplexing, how could he have fathered a child, considering Adam and Eve as the sole progenitors of humanity? By examining the nuances of the Bible, we can uncover the answers to this mysterious enigma. So, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and embark with us on this intriguing discovery. Cain, a central figure in biblical narratives, is presented as the firstborn of Adam and Eve, marking the beginnings of humanity. His relationship with Abel, his younger brother, becomes crucial in the episode of the sacrifice to God as an act of devotion. Both offer their products to God, but divine acceptance falls exclusively on Abel's offerings, leaving Cain's rejected. The reason for this divine rejection remains enigmatic, generating diverse interpretations over the centuries. Some speculate about the nature of the offerings, while others suggest a possible negative attitude in Cain's heart as a determining factor. The rejection stirs growing bitterness in Cain, culminating in the first human tragedy recorded in the Bible. Moved by jealousy and anger, Cain commits the terrible act of fratricide, taking Abel's life. This event, besides being the first manifestation of human frailty and the gravity of sin, echoes throughout history, leaving an indelible mark on the biblical narrative as a warning about the consequences of human choices. God responds to Cain with a severe punishment. Divine wrath manifests in cursing Cain and marking him, making him a visible sign of his transgression. This mark, though not clearly described in the Bible, symbolizes the separation and the burden of sin that Cain would carry with him. God's punishment does not only entail a physical curse, it extends to psychological and emotional consequences. Cain is condemned to wander as a solitary wanderer, distancing himself from God's presence. This exile leaves him at the mercy of his own conscience, bearing the weight of his nefarious choice. Cain's solitude, now distant from both God and human interaction, reflects the depth of separation caused by sin. The solitary wanderer becomes a symbol of spiritual and emotional alienation, a direct consequence of his actions. The Bible narrates Cain's concern about the weight of his curse, fearing he would be killed by others upon encountering him. In response to this apprehension, God places a mark on Cain, ensuring his protection from any mortal vengeance. This divine act not only preserves Cain's life, but also symbolizes God's mercy amidst the consequences of his actions. Here, the first question from skeptics may arise: who were these others that Cain so feared? Were Cain and Abel not the only children of Adam and Eve? Calm down, young grasshopper. Further ahead, you will find answers to these questions. So, let's proceed. In chapter 4, verses 16 and 17, we discover that Cain, even while wandering, finds a woman and establishes a marital relationship. From this union, a son named Enoch is born, marking the beginning of a new generation descended from Cain. Surprisingly, Cain not only survives divine punishment, but also establishes himself notably. He decides to build a city and names it in honor of his son, Enoch. The city becomes a testament to human resilience and the ability to forge a path forward, even in the face of past scars. This choice reflects Cain's determination to create a legacy and a community, challenging the adversities of his wandering condition. However, it is at this point that questions begin to multiply. The biblical text omits explicit details about how and with whom Cain established his marital relationship. In verse 17, we find only the vague information that Cain knew his wife. The hypothesis that other humans coexisted during Cain's time, besides Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, arises as an interpretation meant to fill the gaps in the biblical narrative and address questions related to the expansion of the human population. In this uncertain scenario, a multiplicity of interpretations emerges in the quest for answers to these inquiries. A less conventional approach considers the possibility that God independently created humans besides Adam and Eve's family. Proponents of this theory suggest that for the rapid multiplication of humanity, a significant contingent of people was necessary, something difficult to achieve solely with the direct descendants of Adam and Eve. This perspective arises from the attempt to reconcile the biblical narrative with archaeological and anthropological evidence, indicating the existence of broader human communities in antiquity. However, it is crucial to emphasize that this interpretation is speculative and does not find explicit support in the biblical text. The narrative of Genesis primarily focuses on the story of Adam and Eve's family, without unequivocally mentioning the presence of other human groups contemporaneous with them. The more widely accepted theory proposes that Cain may have married a sister, an interpretation based on understanding the cultural practices and context of the time, as described in the biblical narrative. Contrary to popular belief, the book of Genesis does not specify that Adam and Eve had only Cain and Abel as children. The absence of detailed information may suggest the possibility that Adam and Eve had other children not mentioned in the Bible. The central argument for this hypothesis lies in the understanding that families in that era were considerably larger, and individuals had extremely long lives. For instance, Cain, mentioned in the biblical narrative, lived for hundreds of years. This longevity increases the plausibility that Adam and Eve had a more extensive offspring, including sons and daughters who were not specifically highlighted in the sacred text. This interpretation gains further strength when we delve deeper into the biblical narrative after the incident between Cain and Abel. The story continues, and in Genesis chapter 5, verse 4, we find a reference that strengthens the idea that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. The text mentions that Adam lived for 800 years after the birth of Seth and had other sons and daughters. This passage explicitly evidences the existence of a broader offspring beyond Cain, Abel, and Seth. In that cultural and temporal context, the practice of marriage between siblings was not only acceptable, but also considered necessary for the propagation of the human race at the early stage of history. There were no explicit prohibitions against such unions, and the cultural circumstances and demands of survival may have influenced this practice. The absence of evident restrictions is illustrated by various cases in the biblical narrative, where characters married members of their own families. A notable example is the case of Abraham and Sarah, who were half-siblings. Another example is Isaac, Abraham's son. Following the customs of the time, he married Rebekah, who was his cousin. This union is noteworthy not only for its cultural acceptance, but also for the divine blessing that accompanied it. The biblical account in Genesis 24 describes how Abraham, concerned about finding a suitable wife for his son Isaac, sends his servant to Paddan Aram to seek a wife among his relatives. The servant finds Rebekah, a relative of Isaac, by the well, and she ends up becoming Isaac's chosen wife. This story illustrates not only the cultural practice of marrying relatives at that time, but also highlights the importance placed on the continuity of the family lineage. Additionally, the narrative suggests a belief in divine guidance in these marital arrangements, as evidenced by how Rebekah's selection was perceived as providential. Another classic example of marriage between members of the same family occurs after the flood. According to the Bible, after the Great Flood, Noah and his family, his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were tasked with repopulating the earth. Given the population's scarcity after the flood, Noah's sons had no other option but to marry among themselves, or even with their own sisters, to fulfill the divine mandate to multiply and repopulate the earth. The Bible, in Genesis chapter 9, highlights Noah and his family's responsibility to repopulate the earth and re-establish humanity, fulfilling the divine purpose, which would justify such unions from the perspective of that time. These examples emphasize how, at different stages of biblical history, marriage between family members was considered acceptable and even necessary for the continuity of the human lineage. After extraordinary events, it is intriguing to note that laws against marriage between relatives, such as those established in 780, the Mosaic Law, emerged considerably later, approximately 2,500 years after the creation of Adam and Eve, marking a significant point in the evolution of marital practices. These laws were enacted as part of the covenant with Moses, reflecting the emerging need for regulations as humanity multiplied. The prohibition of incest, outlined in the laws given to Moses, can be understood as a divine act intended to protect humanity and prevent possible negative consequences from inter-family marriages. As populations grew and diversified, the introduction of these laws aimed to preserve genetic health and avoid risks associated with endogamy. The divine regulation against marriage between relatives, as described in the Mosaic laws, unfolds in the book of Leviticus. These prohibitions, meticulously outlined in chapter 18, cover a broad range of family relationships, including specific instructions against sexual relations with mother, father, siblings, uncles, aunts, nephews, nieces, and other close relatives. The book of Leviticus, an integral part of the scriptures, represents a practical extension of the covenant established with Moses, evidencing divine attention to detail in regulating family relationships. It is worth noting that interpretations are subject to significant variation and are frequently debated among different religious traditions and theological groups. Understanding these accounts may vary depending on the approach, cultural context, and specific doctrinal lines. However, it is even more important to highlight that regardless of interpretative differences, there is the perspective that we should not question or doubt God. Respect for tradition and submission to the divine will prevail as fundamental principles, sustaining the conviction that true understanding lies in the confident acceptance of God's word. I hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Click now on one of the two videos that will appear on your screen to continue watching.